It's Mari McInerney from Croaky here at the Advanced Pharmacy Australia's National Conference in Adelaide, and I am here now with one of the presenters of the last session. Would you be able to introduce yourself?
Certainly. So my name is Sepehr Shakib. I'm Professor of Clinical Pharmacology at the University of Adelaide.
Now, your presentation was on repurposing of drugs. For a lay audience, can you tell us first what that is and how at first you seem to be quite an advocate? But
so repurposing of drugs is a really exciting, not so much a new idea, but something that really took off around the time of COVID. Basically what it involves is it's taking a medication that we've been using for one purpose and using it in another area where it's found to be quite useful. And the example that I gave in my talk was a medication that's used for gout, which has now been shown to be useful in people with ischemic heart disease that go into hospital and have things like stents. And so here's this medication for gout that we've been using for years and years and years. And instead of having to develop a brand new drug for heart disease, we've been able to take this drug that we know really, really well and use it in patients who have heart disease. And that's something quite new that we haven't been doing for many, many years. And part of the reason for doing that is because there's been increasing frustration at trying to find new drugs for the treatment of conditions. And so a lot of people have been saying, well, look, we already have over 1,000 drugs that have been approved, and we know that they work in different conditions and they're quite safe. Why don't we try and see if we can find some of these drugs might be useful for those really difficult to treat conditions, like some chronic neurological conditions like, ALS or Parkinson's or dementia, rather than having to start in the lab and go right back to the beginning and invest millions of dollars on a brand new drug. Maybe we can find that some of these drugs that have already been on the market might be able to be useful. And that's really the exciting promise that medication repurposing has.
And then comes the but.
Then comes the but, because unfortunately there's lots of examples where even though we take the medications that have been used in humans and have been found to be safe, and we go, oh, it looks like it might be quite helpful for this condition. What we then do is we then do the clinical trials on patients, and what we find is that actually, even though it looks like it's going to work in the lab, it doesn't actually work in humans. And the underlying issue is that the reason why we don't have really exciting drugs for conditions like ALS or really effective drugs for things like Parkinson's, and we struggle with drugs like dementia, is that our understanding of what happens in the human brain is actually relatively poor. And so then when we try and take drugs and we try and find cures for those conditions, what we find is that they don't work because we actually don't understand the complexity of those disorders, how the brain works particularly well. So unfortunately, they aren't so far been able to fulfill the promise that we thought they might be able to.
And is there a risk of harm in doing that repurposing versus just inconvenience, frustration?
Yes, because of the way the clinical trials are done, then the risk of harm for the clinical trial participants isn't very much. That risk of harm is probably not that different to getting a brand new drug. The example that I gave in my talk, though, was, for example, an antibiotic that was trialed at quite a high dose for ALS, which is a chronic neurological condition, but there's not really a lot of treatments available. And it just so happened that that antibiotic didn't actually work. The difficulty would have been if that antibiotic had worked is, do we really want a very broad spectrum antibiotic that causes problems like diarrhea and other sort of things, but also increases resistance to antibiotics to be used for a chronic neurological condition? And that's really where we start to run into problems. So there may be no harm in the clinical trial participants, but there might be harm to, in this case, the ecology of bacteria. And other times there's harm because when drugs are developed from scratch, they have to go through quite a rigorous process. And there's a pharmaceutical sponsor that looks at all the risks and the benefits and whether it's worthwhile investing the money or not. When that drug development is done by philanthropic organizations, they don't really have the same responsibility in terms of the risk of the molecule because they're not the pharmaceutical sponsor. And so if you have a generic drug that's made by 10 different manufacturers, and that happens to cause some problems with patients going into hospital or causing deaths, there's not one pharmaceutical manufacturer that's held responsible for all those adverse effects, the same way it would be if it was a brand new drug being developed. So repurposing also highlights just some of the issues we have around how we regulate and we encourage drug development to occur.
And have we seen a case where there has been nobody to hold responsible?
Yeah, so in the case that I brought up at the very beginning, where we have a drug for gout being used for heart disease, when we use that medication for gout, it's usually used in just a small course, and that medication can cause some side effects, and it can particularly cause problems in patients with kidney problems, liver problems, or when patients are on multiple different medications. Unfortunately, where it's being used in people with heart disease, a lot of those patients have got kidney problems, a lot of those patients tend to take multiple other medications. And so I guess the word of caution is that in a few years' time, we may start to see some problems with using that medication in that population. And should that occur, there won't be one pharmaceutical sponsor who's then responsible for making sure that that medication is used appropriately, because there's multiple different sponsors and it's just used by doctors in lots of different ways.
What determines where you will try to repurpose a drug? Is it happenstance? Is it driven by profit? What's it driven by? Who determines?
I think it's actually driven by a genuine desire to help people. Because you can't get a patent on a repurposed drug, then oftentimes pharmaceutical companies aren't particularly interested. I mean, you can get a patent, but it's a bit more complicated. And so it's not purely a financial drive. It arises oftentimes for a couple of reasons. So oftentimes you get drug development for cancers that are difficult to treat. You get drug repurposing in rare neurological conditions, like I said, that we don't really have a lot of solutions for. And we actually saw quite a bit of drug repurposing at the time of COVID. It's because we had a lot of patients sick in hospital, in intensive care, and we didn't have the time to go right back to the drawing board and create new drugs. It was really a good opportunity for us to try drugs that we'd given to human beings before. We knew they were reasonably safe, and we could then see whether they worked or not. And so around the time of COVID, there was quite a boost. And in that time, it was really very, very much desperation, and the fact that we really wanted to try and find treatments that were able to genuinely help humanity at the time. So I think a lot of the times the drive is very, very much trying to find solutions for rare cancers, rare disorders, things that are difficult to treat. Unfortunately, the reality is that there are just simply no shortcuts when it comes to drug development. It's really hard, there's a lot of room for failure, and simply by taking an old drug and repurposing it, it doesn't eliminate all the issues of what can go wrong.
So what would be your takeaway message for an audience like this today? Is it just to say, is there a beware? Is there a get moving? What's your message?
I think the main message, particularly for healthcare workers, is that where drug repurposing works really, really well is when we find that we use a drug in human beings for one thing, and we start to notice something about those drugs. So they tend to have a particular side effect, or they tend to actually be beneficial in another condition. And that's really where drug repurposing has been most successful. So what I would say is that if you're a consumer out there and you're finding that you're taking a medication and you're getting some unusual side effects, report that to the Therapeutic Goods Administration, because that information is really valuable. If you're a healthcare professional and you get a consumer that comes to you reporting that either an unusual condition of theirs is getting better or they're getting unusual side effects, again, take that very seriously, because it could actually be starting the very early approach towards repurposing that drug for a brand new use where it could actually help lots of other people.
Fantastic. Anything else we should know about repurposing yet?
No.
Thank you very much for your time.
That's great. Thank you, Marie.